Hello, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I am your host for this podcast. I am delighted today to welcome Derek Newman-Stille, my good friend and colleague. Derek is a disabled, queer, non-binary, fat femme activist, author, artist, academic, and editor. They teach at Trent University, where they are currently completing their PhD examining representations of disability in Canadian speculative fiction. Derek's research interests include disability studies, queer theory, and LGBTQ2IA studies, digital humanities, arts-based research, and speculative fiction. Derek is the 9-time Aurora Award-winning creator of the digital humanities hub Speculating Canada. They have published in academic fora such as Mosaic, a journal for the Interdisciplinary Study of Literature, Creative Teamwork, developing rapid site-switching ethnography, the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, the Canadian Fantastic in Focus, and Misfit Children, an inquiry into childhood belongings. They've also published in the public press in fora such as Quill Quire, Uncanny Magazine, Nothing Without Us, Accessing the Future, The Playground of Lost Toys, and the Spoonie Authors Network. Derek's most recent books are Whispers Between Fairies, Over the Rainbow, Folk and Fairy Tales from the Margins, and We Shall Be Monsters, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 200 Years On. And of course, I know Derek through medieval monster studies. We have such an array of interesting things to discuss today about medieval monsters and disability. And so, Derek, I want to welcome you to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm so excited to be able to be here and to chat medieval studies because it's been a while since I've really been able to delve into sort of my medieval research and look at those ideas of monstrosity in the Middle Ages and also around disability and queerness in the Middle Ages. So it's exciting to be able to have that chance with you. Thank you.
Well, it is my pleasure. And I think, of course, because monsters, everybody has their own idea of, what makes a monster, what makes something monstrous. Can you kind of explain how you see monstrosity, both medieval and modern?
Ooh, that's a really great question and so complex, right? Because often, and we've talked about this before, but the idea of monstrosity extends beyond the folkloric, imaginative, created monsters of humanity and into things like monstrous acts, monstrous behaviors. And we know that early on, for example, and I'm sure you've talked about this before, but the term monster comes from monstrare, which is Latin for essentially body deformities. And this idea that those bodily deformities signal something about the society that they are occurring in. So there's a deep link between disability and monstrosity as early as the classical period. And so these imaginary monsters, the ones that we build through our folklore, come back to and tentatively relate to outsider phenomenon in our own society. And so frequently things that are fringy get projected of liminality, this figure of uncertainty, this figure of desire, this figure of obviously fear and anxiety. But I think there's something really intrinsic about the way that especially outsider phenomenon are projected onto the monster, and the monster becomes a conglomeration of all of these fears, anxieties.
We are experiencing some technical difficulties, so I apologize to our viewers if there are a few glitches. The internet is not entirely cooperating today, but that's okay because we have a transcript and we will make sure we cover everything fully. But it's an important thing that you were saying, Derek, about how societies project their own anxieties, their own fears onto these figures that are considered monstrous. And yes, monstrare, that signals some kind of a deformity, but also is related to the idea of to show, of a portent or an omen. That really a monster doesn't mean big, nasty, terrifying thing with teeth. big, nasty, pointy fangs that lives under your bed and gnaws on your ankles. That's not, or in your closet. I still don't sleep with the closet door open. No, 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 no. Not since Stephen King. No way.
Mm,
No way. But society projects those anxieties onto these figures of
exactly.
monstrosity. And so, how do you see that intersecting with medieval fears or anxieties about ability and disability?
It's interesting because for some reason, disability has often evoked fear within the Western imaginary. And particularly once we get the introduction of Christianity to the West, there is this sort of phenomenon where in the Bible, one of the big things that differentiates Jesus is this ability to heal, the ability to get rid of disability. And so we get this
Lepers, the
polarity
lepers, yes, heal lepers, or even raise people from the dead. Sorry, yeah.
or restore sight. And so all of these phenomena um, create this diametric kind of binary, which I find ironic as a non-binary person, between this idea of holy things, which are come to be associated with able-bodiedness and beauty, and then all of the negative stuff gets projected onto bodies that are disabled, bodies that are disfigured, bodies that don't show that perfection that's imagined within Christianity as the thing that Jesus restores. And so we get this really interesting continuity from the Middle Ages, where even now people will make assumptions that every disabled person will that all under charity. And so we still have this baggage around this idea of looking at the disabled body as a problem body, as broken, as incomplete.
As defective in some way, that something that needs to be corrected rather
That's right.
than adjusting our expectations and our society to help the people who have those different abilities or those perhaps medical issues or some kind of I mean it does count, I guess, as a problem, I suppose, but not to fix it so much but to work with it if it and accept it as part of who they are. Yes, no, am
It's
I
so
wrong?
interesting. It's so interesting, right? Because there's so much complexity here as well around disability. And because we have, I'll quote scholar Eli Clare. Eli talks about this idea of the struggle with the cure, that often for disabled people, the idea of a cure is really complex. There are elements of it that are problematic, that suggest that we are incomplete as disabled people, that we are broken as disabled people, and therefore need to be fixed. But not all of us, and hopefully in the future, none of us will look at ourselves that way. And instead, we'll recognize what's called the social model of disability, which says that the problem is not here, as the medical model and charity model suggest. The problem is out there with the structures that favor certain bodies, favor certain abilities, and assume the exclusiveness of those bodies as that which is acceptable.
And
There's
privileges
been some
them. It privileges them, right? It privileges this idea that, the quote unquote able-bodied person is the standard, is the norm, and any deviation there from that has to be dealt with or in some way accommodated, as opposed to simply recognizing we need to make sure that there are things that everybody can access no matter what. It's not about accommodating one set of people, it's making everything accessible to everybody. Yes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so interesting to see how ideas of the monstrosity and disability are interwoven very early on in texts. Particularly, I'm thinking of Gerald of Wales' Topographia Hibernica. And I,
Oh, Gerald of Wales.
I
Yeah.
know, right? I feel like I have to do the nerd thing of like adjusting my glasses to be like, I'm going to talk about Topographia Hibernica. So, Gerald de Wales in Topographia Hibernica is giving us sort of the history and topography of Ireland. And it's important to note that at the time, this was also a colonial practice of basically projecting Ireland as a broken soil itself was toxic. And these ideas around essentially, Gerald interweaves disability and disabled people with discussions of monsters. There's no differentiation. So he'll talk about like blind folks, and then he talks about werewolves. And so
Yes.
it's really interesting. So I think there's incredible power in looking critically at texts like this around the way that monstrosity and disability are interwoven, especially interwoven with colonialism as well, and with this idea of the broken nation. Now, we get really interesting, like, kind of use of bodily images around talking about nations as well. So we get the idea of the head of the nation. We get imagery of, especially now, we use imagery of disability to show that there's some sort of a problem. And
Right.
so we'll say things currently like, the nation is, the economy is crippled.
Right.
Um, Politicians are deaf to the people.
Or somebody's a lame
Politicians are,
duck. A lame duck politician is the idea of somebody who is no longer capable of actually achieving anything, and associating just the idea of disability with inaction and disability with the without being able to move. And the body politic is an idea that comes in the Middle Ages in the
yeah,
12th and 13th century. Now, Gerald of Wales is 12th century, and you are absolutely right. His discussion of Ireland is unbelievably pejorative. I mean, Gerald of Wales is a bit of an arsehole, but he's also creating this
yes,
image of Ireland as barbaric and using the disability imagery and that werewolf narrative of the werewolves of Ossory, where he encounters this werewolf couple and the wife is dying. And I mean, they present like werewolves. They're on hind legs, as you do, and
yeah,
and the husband werewolf wants communion for his wife who is dying, and so Gerald describes how the priest who encounters them agrees to give that Christian sacrament. And when he does, he literally peels back the werewolf skin to reveal a woman underneath it and gives her confession, gives her communion. She's shriven so that she can die within that Christian communion. And so the contradictions of having, yes, Christian werewolves, but they're still werewolves. And
yeah.
Gerald's sense of the Irish society as barbarian and wild and monstrous and disabled, and therefore justifying to a certain extent the Angevin conquest of Ireland in the 12th century. So, can you talk a little bit more about Gerald of Wales and how he kind of imposes disability as a monstrous aspect in Irish society?
So interesting because part of it is about that idea, the wonders of the East and all of the monstrosity from the South and East, the assumption that here be monsters out there, that the climate of Ireland, the fringiness of Ireland means that it ends up accumulating these monstrous beings. And when Gerald is doing this, he's very much doing it for colonial practices. He's very much doing this kind of ascription for alleviate some of his issues as a Welshman, to be able to suggest that, oh, yes, we are lesser than, but we are not as bad as the Irish.
Which, of
And
course,
so
gets
there's some reconciliation.
yeah, go ahead. No, I mean, and I was going to say there's some reconciliation there, but there's also that sense of creating an ethnic other and saying we're going to say, well, we're not English, true, but at least we're not the Irish, because that would be
Yes,
worse. So do you see that in a,
exactly.
yeah, exactly. I mean, do you see that in a lot of medieval narratives that discuss monstrosity and disability in tandem as a question of projecting an us versus them or creating a sense of other?
It's so interesting because, especially around that otherness sense, Christianity becomes fixated as a centrality, right? As the way of saving those spaces. And we have that happen with the werewolves of Ossory in terms of the idea of getting Christian salvation by peeling off your werewolf skin and showing, hey, I'm actually human under here, so you can give me sacraments. The same sort of thing happens in the East and South with the kynocephaly, sometimes called cynocephaly. But sorry, it's my background
Oh, the
in Greek and
kynocephaly.
Latin.
I mentioned the kynocephaly in my second episode because I was talking about the Lever-Gavala and the idea that the dog-headed people had wiped out one of the groups of the Irish in the Lever-Gavala, the people of Partholon, and that it's an 11th century text that says, and by the way, these dog-headed people killed everybody.
Yeah, and these figures end up essentially being converted and become basically they start to gain humanity through the conversion process, but they are fundamentally then used sort of as attackers on places. They're used as warriors and knights.
And how often do you find that the question of humanity is tied to this issue of disability and monstrosity, or even just monstrosity on its own?
I think it's really central. I mean, we still continue this with the dehumanization of so many disabled people. But in the Middle Ages, we have this notion that disabled bodies are somehow incomplete, that they demonstrate a problem. Sorry, I'm using that monstrare again, demonstrate a problem in the society itself, that they are reflective of the landscape that they're in and the monstrosity inherent in that landscape until it is colonized. And I think there's something really powerful to view in terms of the dehumanization of disabled people, which, as I said earlier, I would argue that we continue to do. We don't give disabled people the same rights as abled people. We don't provide an environment. When we talk about a human space, we provide an environment only for certain types of bodies and not for others. And this means that, of course, like active participation in our society is not possible for disabled folks. And I know that sounds rather extreme, but I think it's really key to see the way that disability and nationhood are often uncomfortable together, particularly because we don't afford the same rights to disabled people, even especially currently in terms of marriage equality ideas. There isn't marriage equality for the disabled population. So
Right.
if, for example, someone is on benefits and they get married to someone who's able-bodied, they lose their disability benefits, they lose their income, and are assumed to then be cared for by another person.
Is that the same in the United States as it is in Canada?
It is, yeah. It's really interesting to see like our in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is supposed to afford all of these possibilities, but it doesn't, much like the Ontarians for Disability Act here in Ontario, where I'm located, in Canada, and various of our provincial sort of programs for supporting disabled folks. The Americans with Disability Act claims that it's going to make things equal and make sure that everyone is equal. What it assumes, though, is that everyone has access to the same things.
And that's one of the main differences, even when we talk about equity versus equality, is having access to everything. It's not about a level playing field, it's about being able to access the playing field at all. And when you consider issues of both marriage equality in terms of um, queer rights as well as disability rights, and just think of the larger questions in America about what's being taken away with our health care, what's being taken away, the bill that just passed. And I did warn you all that modern politics would come into these discussions. I said
Yes.
that it would. The bill that was just passed, in many respects, makes it so much more difficult for people to survive as individuals on their own without the marital support network. And even people who are on disability are going to lose those benefits through Medicaid. I mean, this is not an abstract concept that we say, okay, these things are not related, but they are. And when we look at the way medieval society dealt with leper colonies or people who had diseases or people, even the investigation of diseases, or what manifestation of that difference, how that affects their standing in society. Did medieval people figure it out better than we did and we've just ignored them? Or is it just this progress of still trying to push people with disabilities and push others aside?
Absolutely. There's still this centralization of this idea of the normative, right? The bodies that our society favors. Often people use the term normal. I feel uncomfortable with that term in general, but especially in terms of the binaristic sort of normal versus disabled. I prefer able-bodied versus disabled. Or normative bodied, because we essentially that's a social construction. What we consider normal is actually created by our imagination of what the perfect body should be. So it's really fascinating, and particularly when we look at ideas of fringiness, this becomes really essential for examining the way that disability is projected on our society. In terms of medieval society, you're often seeing depictions of disabled people as beggars and as recipients of charity. And that idea is still entrenched. We still find this idea of like, sorry, we talk about in medieval study, or sorry, in disability studies, my other field, I have to switch hats, around this idea of the charity industry as something that is exploitative in many ways, that it is using our bodies as disabled people to make money. But also, this idea of situating us as charity means that we have to project, and we are projected as tragic, as broken, as in need of fixing, right? Yeah.
And,
There's
and
this,
it's of course because charity comes from the Latin caritas, which also means to care. And of course, in the Catholic duties of obligation, one of them is charity, is to conduct good deeds that are essential to Catholic salvation. And of course, in Protestantism after the Reformation, it takes on a completely different meaning. But this idea that, well, we have to find somebody who needs our help, because if we don't have people who need our help, we don't get that sense of salvation. We don't get that Catholic or even Christian sense of we are a better person because we have actually given charity. And as a consequence, if you make things more equitable, if you make sure people have enough food to eat, if you make sure everybody has medical care, if you make sure that every person, regardless of their ability or inability to physically do things, if you make sure that they can function, live independently on their own, have access to what they need, then we don't need your stinking charity. And then that comes into conflict with this sense of, yes, but my entire religious ideology says I got to do charity. I got to have somebody to give it to first. And, that is not to diminish the people who genuinely, out of goodness, commit acts of charity, but it is saying that if we made society better for everybody, the charity would not be as necessary. And in the Middle Ages, this is a major discourse because the church is pushing charitable works. And so in order to do that, you have to have an object upon which to project your charity. Is that
that's
right?
absolutely. We become objects of charity. Weirdly enough, as you pointed out, we are also necessary for that charitable system. So at the same time that charities will say that they're trying to erase disability or fix us, ultimately fixing us would cause them a deficit. And
Yeah.
so we have these ideas of, in disability studies, we talk about the idea of the good cripple and the bad cripple. And so the good cripple is the conformist, like wants charity, is grateful, is constantly seeking approval from others and wants to be fixed. The bad cripple is someone like me who extends the middle finger at society and says we actually need apparatus of our society changed to actually include and properly celebrate all bodies. And
Right.
so,
And sorry, just I was going to say, and to touch on that though, that's not to say that you don't want to find medical solutions to things that cause you discomfort, or medical solutions that might help you alleviate some of the actual very real physical limitations of a disability. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be fixed. It doesn't mean that you have to be changed to fit into society's idea of what is whole.
yeah, in fact, it's up to society to change to include our bodies. And it's really interesting because I mentioned earlier Eli Clare's work, and Eli talks about this idea of the struggle with the cure, that we are not, the cure means different things to different people. Some of us would fix certain things, but not others. For example, for myself, would I get rid of my spinal pain? Absolutely. I would 100% get rid of it. Would I get rid of my neurodiversity? Absolutely not. My neurodiversity. I love being someone with ADHD and autism. And so it really is a struggle with the idea of the cure and a struggle with what the cure represents for us, how it shapes us, and how we relate to these ideas.
And do you think that, of course, in particularly the modern political discourse, particularly in the United States, and to a certain extent in Europe and potentially in Canada as well, the way that a lot of very industrialized nations look at ability, it's almost like it's a reflection of our self-worth. Whereas there are other societies and other countries of the world, and even in the Middle Ages, where they had a different view of some of those people who would be considered disabled in a Western tradition, but are not considered disabled in, say, an Eastern, an Asian, or even an African tradition.
It's really interesting, and I'm going to briefly put on my socialist hat and say there's something about disability that is irreconcilable with capitalism. And I realize that as I'm saying that, people are probably like,
It's okay.
comedy.
That's fine. No, I mean, it's okay because you're right. And you are right, but I'll let you finish the thought.
Yeah, and so one of the reasons why I say this is that um, essentially our societies are dependent on the notion of productive bodies.
And if you are disabled,
Within a
you are not
capitalist system,
productive. Yes.
according to a capitalist system, right?
Yeah.
Because we're still producing things. We're just not producing things the way capitalism would like us to, which is very structured, very specific hours, always producing physical products, and this idea of marketability as well. And so all of these things impact the way that disability is being viewed, especially in terms of the burden narrative. Now, we see that hugely in terms of many politicians in Canada and the US around their comments about like disabled people as being a drain on the economy and around this idea of we need to cut back on extra expenditures. We shouldn't be considered as disabled people to be an extra expenditure. We should be recognized as contributors to our society no matter what we produce or how we produce it.
Well,
And
and that's
so I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, I was to say, and that's a very important point to even consider when we talk about academic discourse and this whole question of education. What is valuable? What is marketable? Are you getting a degree in something that will get you a job? As though that's the only end game, that's the only desirable outcome, is fitting into this productive society as defined by the capitalist model. And, we are all part of this capitalist model, because we're here, we're doing this. But if you think about just the mindset that says people have to fit into this sense of productivity. Do you see an influence from the Middle Ages in modern society there? Or do you think that the Middle Ages had a completely different approach to productivity, to labor, to the value of
Yeah.
labor?
I think there is a huge difference in the Middle Ages, but it's not focused in the same way. I don't know how to articulate that better, but there's not the same sense of having to produce things mechanically, which we've got as
Technology, yeah.
technology has increased, and particularly as labor technology. Sorry, I missed that.
No, I was affirming what you were saying. I was also filling a very small gap in the, because I knew what you were going to say, and there was a small gap because the internet. We're working with it. It's so fun.
We're working
We're working with it. It's cool. We can roll with it. It-
it.
It's a learning curve.
It's a learning curve. So
It is.
there is a concept that Rob McCrur, who is a disability studies scholar, talks about, which he's borrowing the idea of compulsory heterosexuality and says that there is a compulsory able-bodiedness in our society, that our society assumes able-bodiedness and projects anything other than able-bodiedness as a problem to be solved.
I mean, that makes sense. And if you
Compulsory
consider,
heterosexuality.
yeah. Sorry, you glitched there on the compulsory heterosexuality, of course, from biblical norms, even though there's really nothing in the Bible much about sexuality at all. Not at all. The word in Greek means liars of men, and that is just a reference to rape, not actually a reference to consensual same-sex relations. And don't worry, viewers, we will have an episode entirely on medieval sex. That will happen too. And we will certainly have discussions on sexuality and sexual identity in the Middle Ages. But this idea of a compulsory heterosexuality, and in some ways, how much do you think this is projected back onto the Middle Ages by modern audiences? And the same thing with disability and ability. How much of that do you think is our modern prejudices that we're throwing back into the Middle Ages and going, but of course they thought the same way that we did?
Exactly. I think it's really interesting. And I'm sure you've talked about this before, but we do project our ideas of the modern onto the past. We project our assumptions that everything that we do, there's the concept of traditional, right? We find that that is intensely tied to the idea of compulsory heterosexuality in terms of the discourse of traditional marriage. Well, traditional marriage didn't always function the way that we're calling traditional marriage. So there were, like, it was mostly a political allegiance
Or
in
a
the past.
financial one,
It
yes.
often involved, or financial, it often involved the exchange of goods. It often involved alliances between peoples. And marriage didn't always occur in the same way either. So, and it's really interesting, Ronald, that only applies to an idealized concept that is largely projected from people who are in positions of power to be able to say, hey, this is tradition, even if there's no historical precedent for it. We get this in terms of, I like to use the example of the binaries around gender and color choices, right? Like we project this idea that pink is a girl's color, that it's always been a girl's color, and that blue is a boy's color, and that it's always been a boy's color. When we look through the past, that's not the case. We
No.
have, in fact, pink was considered very masculine.
Well, and it's the same thing with
And
fashion
I like
ideas
to use,
too. It's the same thing with fashion ideas and the question of cross-dressing versus trans identity, which, a project I'm working on now is on the cross-dressing aspect. I intersect a little bit with trans studies, but I am not a trans studies scholar specifically. There are amazing scholars, and I hope to bring some of them onto this program to talk to them as well. But cross-dressing served a variety of purposes in the Middle Ages. And the research that I've been doing on it is that in a lot of cases, it's women dressing as men to obtain social and political office and religious office that was otherwise denied to them because of their gender.
That's it. And that continued on for quite some been recent looks at for example, migrant Chinese workers in railway construction. Much like the US, Canada created these railway systems as a way of linking a huge country together. And so what happened was we started finding photos of folks who when you look at the photo, you realize that one of the people who is a man in it is actually a woman, or I shouldn't say, or presenting, or AFAB anyway, assigned female at birth,
Right.
and is presenting as male to get work. And I
Right.
wonder how much intersection there is between the folks who are like, hey, I can get work if I dress like a man, and the people who are already feeling like, hey, I'm actually a man, it turns out.
Yeah.
And so I wonder about how cross-dressing trans identities intersect in so many ways, especially historically.
Well,
But
and
it's
there are
really
a lot, and that's an interesting question about it because there are a lot of cases of people who cross dress who may or may not see themselves as, this is my correct gender or not, or I'm doing this for economic purposes. And yes, there's certainly intersections for that. I mean, Eleanor Reichert, who's a very well-known trans prostitute, she was a sex worker in the 16th century. Actually, I take that back. I believe she's 14th century, and the court records talk about her case, and she identifies as female. She is trans and she is a sex worker, and she comes up into the court and they discuss her as a woman. But then you look at other women who may or may not identify as male, but it doesn't matter because they are denied the access to those capitalist structures, to those specific power structures, because they were born female at birth. And the Roman de Silence is an example of that. It's a brilliant French text that we will talk about at length in another episode. But there are all these episodes, and people in the modern day, they want to say, trans, no, horrible, no, stop it. Bollocks. There have always been trans people. Trans people have always existed. And it's cross-dressing has always happened. Trans identity has always happened. Sexual identity that is non-binary has always existed in some form or another. Every society on the planet has people in it who do not fit into those social boxes that we try to construct. And they never did. They never did.
actually in recent years, the rhetoric is that we've just come out of nowhere and have suddenly appeared. And yet we know from historical documents, we as trans folks have always been here. There's always been a variety of different gender identities. There's always been a richness of gender expression. And yet we're constantly being portrayed as new. And that's a technique to be able to constantly project us as a trend or a fad. And that rhetoric is often being used, especially in the US right now, around trans identity.
Yes. And it's also used as a disruption.
That, oh,
Yeah.
what if it's just a fad?
Yeah,
What if someone,
exactly. It's a disruption.
yeah,
It's a fad. You'll grow out of it. And there are instances, of course, as always with everything, that's, yes, some people might go, no, I'm just more fluid than not. But the desire to say, no, we've got to fix this. No, we've got to make you back into what we want you to be. There is some of that in the Middle Ages, but there's not as much of it as you would think. You want to explain?
I'm so glad that you say that because I think there is this conception of um, more fluidity in different identities in the past than we give credit for. We pretend that transness is new, and that's an erasure technique. We're literally having our history replaced. And I look to scholars like Gabrielle Bukowski, who is doing work on trans identities in the Middle Ages,
And I
who
do hope to have Gabby on this show. I will pin her down.
I love Gabby. She's absolutely brilliant, and she knows this stuff so well. But we even get figures like Joan of Arc, which people wouldn't like immediately think trans, but she is identifying with masculine pursuits. She's doing male things, and it's very questionable about her identity and whether I should be referring to this as his identity or their identity. Because Joan of Arc has this very like realizes that Joan needs to do some important masculine work that is generally assigned to people who are assigned
Well, and the important
male
thing,
at birth.
right? And
And
the
so it's
important thing
really
about,
interesting just to see the way that,
yeah, the interesting thing about Joan of Arc, of course, is that she was burned at the stake for wearing clothes of the opposite sex. The thing is, that's not really why she was burned at the stake. It was a political reason. I mean, she was a threat to the very Dauphin that she put on the French throne. I mean, when she wins the Battle of Orleans and she is held up as this military leader, the Dauphin is like, fuck. This young
yeah,
woman is going to you potentially be a more popular leader than I am. And so what happens with that dynamic, and he orchestrates having her handed off to the English authorities in Rouen, which is still English territory at that point. And the Burgundians take her, give
yeah.
her to the inquisitorial court, and she is interrogated and tortured. And they use the cross-dressing as a justification and an excuse. But that's not
Ex
really why she's burned at the stake in 1431. That's not really why.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because we think about this is so reflective of the current political moment in the US, because we have similarly trans identity as a scapegoat and distraction from other things that are occurring. And so this politicalization of trans bodies, this assumption that we can project things onto trans bodies in order to do other things that we want to, in order to solidify power amongst wealthy elites, has been going on at least since Joan of Arc, right?
Well, and I mean,
So
how
it's really
does, I mean,
fascinating.
yeah, when you think about it, this also ties into the monstrosity aspect in the Middle Ages. This ties into monster studies. It ties into the monsters in literature. It ties into the monsters of art. Because, of course, how do we create something that scares us? How do we create something that serves as a portent, as a warning? You make it identifiable as something that doesn't look like us. So I'm going to change tack a little
Exactly.
bit and say, what are some of your favorite medieval stories, monsters or otherwise?
Ooh, so you might have noticed that I have this particular fascination with Gerald of Wales. And so, honestly, Topographia Hibernica is one of my favorite medieval texts. And it is so powerful because of the diversity of monsters that it shows, the reflections on gender that it shows, um, and I think also ideas around disability. So there's a lot of intertwining there that creates a sense of the essential power of like normativity in our societies and the way that normativity and colonialism are interwoven in terms of like the best way to conquer someone is to say they're a monster. We had this phenomenon happening back in the ancient Greek and Roman world as well, where folks would say, like, oh, we are attacking these people because they're doing monstrous things, including, and this is kind of hilarious, Christianity. So when Christianity was sort of coming about and it was still practiced in like house churches, in secret basements and in secrecy largely, the Romans were like, the Christians are actually cannibals. That's why we need to oppress them because they're dangerous, they're scary. There's been all these fires lately, and they talk about burning, and they also talk about eating their god's flesh and drinking his blood. So
Yeah.
clearly, they are open about being cannibals.
And actually, that's a very
And I
important
find this
point.
so fascinating the way that
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. And
Yeah.
that's a very important point because when you think about the way that Christianity and Christian doctrine itself has shifted over the centuries of Christianity, and as the Catholic Church tried to codify what was acceptable, what wasn't, transubstantiation is a doctrine, and transubstantiation is that process by which at Mass the priest holds aloft the Eucharist, the little bell goes off, and according to Christian Catholic belief, the wafer, the Eucharist, literally becomes the body of Christ, and the wine is literally the blood of Christ. And
Right.
that's not codified in doctrine until 1215 in the Fourth Lateran Council. Before
Right.
that, it was symbolic. And as I like to tell my students, and I'm probably going to get an awful lot of Catholics very angry at me for saying this, I grew up Catholic, back off. Um, and besides, my family has papal dispensations. We've got papal indulgences that absolve my entire family of every sin we might commit. It's awesome. I will show them on screen at some point.
Yes.
But that aside, if you think about it, I like to tell my students, take this, all of you, and eat. It is my body. Zombie. Take this and drink, all of you. This is my blood. Vampire. And so, you have your Jesus zombie or your
Yes.
Jesus vampire. I'm so sorry. I know I'm being irreverent. I apologize if it offends anyone. But I had a student who was a devout evangelical Christian when I taught at Longwood who looked at me very plainly and said, Dr. Tracy, he is not a zombie. He's creating a zombie army. I lost it. She broke me. That was broke. I was broken. That's almost as good as the joke, the punchline of which is he rolls the stone away, comes out, sees his own shadow, 6 more weeks of winter. That joke is in honor of my
Oh,
friend
I
Chris
love
Light.
that.
But and I say this again, not to mock Catholicism, not to mock Christian belief, but to actually point out that this was a problem in the Middle Ages. People were
Yeah.
uncomfortable with that doctrinal shift of transubstantiation because it is cannibalism and it is tied into this question of Eucharistic sanctity, as well as even the debate about the relics of Christ. I mean, can you have relics of Jesus when he ascended to heaven and all of his bits were meant to go with him? And so, how do you have the umbilical cord of Christ? And if you think I'm making that up, there's one of those in the Musée de Moyen Age in Cluny. And it's a beautiful reliquary. It's the baby Jesus sitting on Mary's lap, and there's a little window in his abdomen, and it has a little bit that looks like rice, and it is the holy umbilical cord because somebody said pick that up, we're going to need it later. It's kind of like the circumcision, is that there are churches that purport to have the foreskin of Christ. Again, pick that up. We're circumcising. He's a good Jewish boy. We've circumcised him and pick that up. We're going to need it later. But this whole debate about whether or not you can even have relics of Christ because he ascends is tied into the corporality of Christianity, is tied into this question of an intact body, is tied into the whole question of what makes a body whole and what makes a body
Yeah.
normal, and that ties into this
That's
question of
it.
transubstantiation as well. And medieval people really had an issue. There were sects that were deemed heretical for not agreeing with transubstantiation because they're like, dude, that's cannibalism. No, we're not doing it. We don't eat our God. It's symbolic. And the Catholic Church was like, heretic, because the Cathars believed that.
Exactly.
And they waged an entire crusade,
It's
but
so interesting.
it is tied into that question of bodily integrity.
Well, and so many cases also, people assume that disabled bodies will become whole when they're resurrected, when they're
Right,
brought
at
back,
the final judgment. Yeah.
which is such an interesting doctrine because it presents the idea, once again, that disabled bodies are a mistake to be fixed. And yet there's some sort of um, discomfort around this idea as well. And because of the fact that like God is supposed to create everything in his image, what does the disabled body represent? How does that fit into the idea of God's image? And there were, for many cases, even though it wasn't official church doctrine, ideas of changelings and things like this, that are supposed to be either like a fairy or a sprite or an imp. Um, Essentially like creates their own child and steals the original proper baby away and leaves this disabled body instead. And so this projection of these bodies as other bodies, otherworldly, but also threatening bodies. And some of the practices around discovering if a baby is actually a changeling are going to damage the disabled body. So,
They're
Aurora,
horrifying. They're horrifying. Yeah, I mean, in
absolutely.
1897, there's an excellent book called The Burning of Bridget Cleary, and it's about the trial of Bridget Cleary's husband from 1897 in rural Ireland, where he believed that his
Yeah,
26-year-old wife, who had become willful, who had become difficult to control, who'd become basically mouthy. She's 26 and, she's an independent thinking woman. He was convinced she was a changeling and he murders her
yeah,
because he puts her in the fireplace. And his justification is she's a changeling. She's been replaced by the fae, by the fairy, and she's become part of the wild hunt. And
yeah.
so he had to kill the changeling in order to get her back. So he burns her in the fireplace. It causes her death. And they let him off. He was acquitted. Burning my changeling wife was a legitimate motive for murder, and he was acquitted in 1897 for that.
It's so interesting too, because we still have this weirdness around killing disabled bodies. So I don't know if Americans are familiar with the Tracy Latimer case,
I don't know
but
that one.
yeah, oh, I guess it was in the 80s. Um, I can't remember her father's name, but Tracy Latimer's father kills her because she's disabled and gets away with it. And basically is like tries to say she must have been suffering so much that I actually freed her. And so there's this idea, and we get the same thing with Angel of Mercy cases.
Yeah, as I say, mercy killings. Yes.
Exactly. And with Angel of Mercy cases, we have a doctor or nurse or some kind of medical professional who comes in and kills the dead. And we have this concept in disability studies of better dead than disabled.
Yeah.
And so we see that imagery in all of our pop culture, which influences the way we think about this. And so in narratives like, sorry, I know you're also a fan of speculative fiction and fantasy. In these stories, always, if there is a disabled character, they either die by the end of the narrative or they become able-bodied through some sort of magical intervention, or with science fiction, a medical intervention. So there's a discomfort that many authors have with the idea that someone can be disabled and live a happy life. And this, of course, influences the way that society thinks about disability. And I would say that that cultural practice of the imaginary and closer than we would like to, and historically, um, continuing from historical periods, have been about this idea of the stories we tell influence the policies that we create. So right now, one of the big debates in Canada, sorry, I'm being the Canadian studies nerd
That's
here,
okay.
is around medical assistance in death, what we call MAID. And
Right.
so medical assistance in death has been a policy that has been approved and with some reticence from the disabled community. So there's a particular activist, Catherine Frazee from Toronto, who looks at made as actually a big problem because we don't have a society right now that allows a disabled person to live safely. So death becomes the only option. And we've seen this happen in numerous cases. In fact, a friend of mine who had a heart attack and had, as a result, kidney failure, was constantly being told by her doctors. She's also Indigenous, so there's racist component as well. So it's constantly told by her doctors, the maid is always an option. You can always choose like medical assistance in death if that's an easier option.
Sorry, I'm putting my
And so
yeah,
being, I know,
yeah.
right?
No, I will, and because and it's interesting. I'm a huge fan speculative fiction, yes, but also murder mysteries. And
Yes.
Louise Penny, I'm reading the Gamache series. I just finished the most recent one. Shout out to Louise Penny. Your books are amazing. Your books are phenomenal. I read them.
Yes.
They are literary crack. Um, but in one of her books, most recently, the one that she wrote during the pandemic, she tackles that policy. And of course, I wasn't aware that maid in Canada was such a stridently pushed policy, but the entire plot revolves around a scientist or a statistician who says, well, we'd be better off if we didn't even let disabled people make the decision for themselves, if we just went ahead and did it, because all the people who died in the pandemic, all of the people who died because of the shutdowns, all of the people who were not capable of looking after themselves, it would just be better off if they were medically allowed to die. And the plot of the whole book revolves around that, and especially because one of the characters, they have a child with Down syndrome, and this question of, well, who decides what is a productive life, who decides what is a valuable life, who decides what is more valuable. You have the same discussion around abortion in this country, where people are like, well, the poor woman who was just kept alive on life support, she was dead, and they just stated her child. And all the discussions, oh, she gave birth. No, she didn't. She's dead. She did not give
No.
birth. That child was medically removed from her body and is now in NICU because the child was born almost, like a pound and a half, severely premature. And of course, on top of all of that, they're making her family pay for it.
It boggles my mind that also in the US that you have to pay for giving birth, like that you have to pay for that medical procedure. Sorry, this is the Canadian. It is wild. I can't imagine having a baby and then be presented with a bill for it. Like it's just mind-boggling.
Let alone a
So
family
yeah,
that's
the
been
Adriana
forced to deal with that. Yeah.
Exactly. And the Adriana Smith case is a huge one for Georgia's policies around pregnancy. It's so interesting too, because the same people who would push for her to have a baby would also probably have an issue if she had a child who was disabled,
Right.
right?
And
Um,
wouldn't want to provide any
and
kind
we
of
have
public
like one
assistance
of
for
the
that, or any kind of support for that. And you're right. And I mean, what happened to Adriana Smith is just horrific for the family, horrific for her family, and just what it says about our society as a whole in America. And in Canada, the idea that, well, you're on dialysis, you might want to consider suicide. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me. I mean, I am all for death with dignity if that is your choice and your decision, but to make it a policy where it's just like, you're costing the state too much money, maybe we should,
that's
put
it.
put you out of our misery. And that's what it becomes, putting us out of our misery, not yours.
And there's a eugenics component to this, right? This idea of a disabled body is not a life worth living. That assumption is based in so many, like, is the basis for so many policies, so many ideas. I will say, just in terms of a little side note, so probably it's pretty obvious to people, I am pro-choice. I believe that it's a woman's right to decide about her child and whether to birth her child. One of the areas where I get conflict and conflicted feelings is around the medical pressure to abort, for example, babies who look like they're going to have Down syndrome, trisomy 21. This is problematic because we've already seen through this policy a drastic reduction in the number of people with Down syndrome being born because doctors will say things like, friends of mine recently had a child with Down syndrome. When they did the sort of
The
oh,
amniocentesis.
amniocentesis, thank you. They discovered that she was going to be born with Down syndrome. And the first thing that doctor said was,
Do you want to terminate?
you might want to consider getting rid of this child. This child will, yes. And they kept on going. Like they were like, this child would be a burden on you for your entire life. You will have to look after this child into adulthood. And all of these assumptions of burden got put on their shoulders. So there's the idea of aborting a fetus that looks like it will possibly have Down syndrome or other quote unquote genetic disorders.
Right. And of course, I think the difference becomes having all of the information and being able to make informed decisions, and also understanding that if there are social networks to help you with the finances, to help you with the medical needs of any child that is born with Down syndrome or differently abled. I mean, this is not the same thing as a child who won't live, or a child who won't live more than a few hours, or that, that's a completely different question about medical complications, pre-birth and prenatal. But I think in many respects, our own ideas about monstrosity and about disability are tied to our own fears. And do you see the same thing in the Middle Ages, and how our fears inform how we look at both monstrosity and disability?
Oh, absolutely. Especially in terms of the way that medieval monsters are created, they're often like the folklore around them, the creation of them. I think it's Jeffrey Jerome Cohen who says, um, and I'm paraphrasing, but our monsters are our children.
Right.
We create our monsters. They come out of everything that we feel is fringe. So Jeffrey talks about this idea of them representing our fears, anxieties, and also our desires. They come to represent things like freedom, the ability to do what you want, the ability to go off into the woods, the ability to do things that are taboo,
Yeah.
right? Or a great number of these tales talk about the idea that the werewolf normally is bad, and we get the same thing in Arthur and is it
Gorlagon, Arthur and
Orlagon.
Gorlagon. Yeah.
Thank you. And in that, there's that line, be a wolf, and have the understanding of a man. So again, this idea of can the soul occupy wolf form? Um, and we get this sympathetic werewolf coming out around the 12th century in texts like Arthur and Gorlagon, Lully de Bisclaveret, Guillaume de
Now, I will say Guillaume de Per.
Pernay, and
Yeah.
Topographia Hibernica.
I
Um,
say Guillaume de Perlern is really about the more sympathetic werewolf.
yes.
I mean, I don't find any sympathy for Bisclaveret, but that's just me. But
Yeah.
also possibly parts of Marie's audience. But then there would have certainly been those people who were like, "Go werewolf" in Bisclaveret. Arthur and Gorlagon is 14th century, and it's a Latin text that really, I mean, he is savage. He is just unbelievably savage, and he goes on a human consciousness fueled tear of revenge. And the sadistic just ending of that text, where, the woman with the head on on the platter, and Jeff Massey wrote a fantastic chapter on this for our beheading volume on Heads Will Roll. But the wife sitting there with the severed head of her lover, and the husband who makes her kiss it every time he kisses his new wife. And it shows that
Exactly.
he's sadistic, he's violent. And so when he was a werewolf, he was worse. But that's only because the wolf form gave him the freedom, but also the physical power to be more violent and more bloodthirsty.
It's so interesting too, because like as I was saying about the werewolf being liminal, this also comes into the idea of transubstantiation, ironically. The idea of transformation as a central church doctrine, and this idea of essentially a body able to go through a transformative process, either without God's influence or somehow God is allowing this. So it brings up this question of essentially in biblical texts, only God is able to change the nature of things. And so it raises the question, is this something God is allowing? And so it sort of figures in the mythosphere of the Middle Ages around critical questions around the supernatural and their relationship to God.
Well,
Thing
and yeah, and
medieval Christian.
yeah, well, and that's actually, and I want to, we need to wrap up here shortly because we've been,
Oh, yes.
no, we've been having a wonderful conversation. Um, and I want to just wrap up and kind of finalize this whole discussion on that idea of ability, disability, monstrosity, both medieval and modern. For medieval people, when they have this idea that God does not make mistakes, that however
That's right.
somebody is, however they are born, whatever their attributes are, this is just who they are because God has ordained it thus. And this comes into conflict throughout the Christian Middle Ages in a variety of different ways. And do you see ultimately that modern society needs to look at the way that medieval society understood itself, monstrosity, disability? And I mean, medieval society was not all sweetness and light, and they certainly did some awful things. But you think about how medieval society tried to at least understand or deal with the monstrous. Do you
Yeah.
think that modern society can learn from medieval society in that aspect?
It's so interesting because I think one of the key things about the supernatural in the Middle Ages is that there's always this conflicted quality to it. Like, even when we get to ghost stories, right? Like, we'll take these narratives and turn them into lessons about hell, being like basically taking these stories and being like, and this actually is what happens when the soul suffers. This is a soul who is in torment. These souls are not supposed to be on earth. And similarly, like within them, there's always that truthy narrative. And that's something we continue today, is this idea of, well, I heard it from a valuable and respected source.
Right.
The same
Okay.
thing
We need
happens in,
credibility. You got to have credibility for those ghost stories. Because as you say, in the Middle Ages, ghosts were not supposed to exist. Ghosts, in theological terms, the soul was not supposed to be present here interacting in any way. And yet, in the purest form of the word of monster, ghost stories are omens. They are portents. They are warnings.
yeah, about what comes next in the afterlife. It's so interesting too that claim to truth, that idea of I heard it from a trustworthy person, happens with werewolf texts as well. Can I read a quick section from
Sure.
Topographia Hibernica?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, Gerald says, I'm aware that I shall describe some things that will seem to the reader to be either impossible or ridiculous. But I protest solemnly that I have put down nothing in this book, the truth of which I have not found out from either the testimony of my own eyes or that of reliable men found worthy of credence and coming from the districts in which the event actually took place. So we get that claim to truth, this idea of even though these things should not be happening in God's universe, they did. And we have proof from priests.
Right.
The same thing happens in Bisclaveret as well. In the introduction, Marie de France says, I thought of lays which I had heard and did not doubt, for I knew it full well that they were composed by those who first began them and then into their circulation to perpetuate the memory of adventures they had heard. I myself have heard a number of them and do not wish to overlook. So it, and also, here's another line. The adventure you have heard actually took place. Do not doubt it.
Right. It's that need for credibility, and it's not unlike Geoffrey of Monmouth, who claims that, of course, the story that he came to him from an ancient British, Welsh book that, as soon as he finished transcribing it, it crumbled to dust. But you
Yeah.
can't question it because I have that authority. And on that note, I want to Thank you, Derek, so much for this wonderfully engaging conversation. And I will hopefully have you back again for another episode. We can talk about childhood. We can talk about, more monsters in the Middle Ages. But Derek Newman-Stille, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. And I'm sorry I only got to the werewolves at the end.
That's okay, because at least we got to the werewolves. Thank you all so much, and catch our next episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I will see you next time.